Okay. I think we're set here. Just want to check and make sure that the recording is, whoops, going as I intended. All right, looks like it. Let me see here. All right. Yep. So good afternoon. I suppose when you guys watch this, it could be late afternoon, early evening on Friday if you're doing this evening, or it'll be over the weekend. But I'm recording on Friday afternoon, about the time when we're typically in class together. So I've had a couple more questions about why I'm doing the recordings. That I've tried to address this already, so I'm going to do a kind of a sequence of addressing some questions here real quickly. Let me do some, make sure that the screen is right here. So first and foremost, this is for the Willamette Valley, although we have had wildfires in recent years, over the past 9-10 years. It hasn't typically affected the Willamette Valley, particularly the Salem area, quite like this before. So there are a lot of students in my classes who are dealing with either being displaced from their homes themselves, or more than likely they're helping family members or perhaps friends who are dealing with the realities of these fires. So that has been just a situation throughout this week as it has unfolded. And many of them are just not able to, obviously be on campus because we're not on campus, but even to make it to synchronous Zoom class sessions during our normally scheduled class times together. So I've gone away from the synchronous Zoom option for the moment. It's not that we can't do that, but this week in these circumstances, it just was not working for more than 24 of my students. I have about 130 students this semester, so a fair portion of them, and I didn't want them to just be completely left out of the mix and have to scurry around finding notes and everything else. So I'm doing this asynchronous option, recording lectures, and I'll be posting them all, and obviously you're watching them now. So I just wanted to address that. I didn't want students to wonder why. I realize that many or most of your other professors are doing the synchronous model, and that's up to them. And it's possible that they didn't have as many students who simply were really struggling with making it to class sessions even in Zoom. So, and that's fine. But many of mine were, and so I'm doing it this way. Couple of other things. I am consistently getting a lot of emails like, with questions such as, how come we're not having class? Even had a student ask me, where are you? Did you oversleep? It was an interesting accusatory question. And just basically wondering what's going on. So rule number one, I suppose rule number one should be just be a little bit more considerate and respectful when addressing professors, I suppose. So if you're someone who's not aware of this, then just reconsider some things. Most of you, in fact, like 99% of you are just fantastic, and you don't have to worry about that. But rule number one, I suppose, number 1A should be always check your Corbin email, especially during times of crisis, but throughout the semester, always check your Corbin email. Through the Populi system, we are able to send out automated messages that go to the students registered in our particular courses, or even broadly to all the students registered in all of the courses that we're each teaching. I prefer the email because I get to be more detailed. I don't want to use the text messaging option. It has some limitations that I don't think are great for the kinds of messages I'm sending. So I'm going to be sending through the Populi system. I'm going to send these messages out. They will come to your Corbin email, which means you've got to check them. I've had some students say, well, I didn't get your Corbin emails. Well, you did. Um, if you're registered in the course, then you got it. So if you didn't see it, well, that means you need to check into the way you have your settings done for your Corbin email, because I suspect that, like a number of students, you may have unwittingly been sending your emails from professors to a junk mail box somewhere, and you haven't seen them for that reason. So that's up to you. You've got to check your email settings and make sure that you're actually, the protocol is for the emails to come to you that you will see. Please be aware of these things. I don't want to put us in a situation where you guys aren't getting the emails I'm sending to you. So please try to do that. Oh, let's see. There was another issue that I had. I had a note about it and I left it back in my computer area. No biggie. I'll probably think of it if I need to address it. I will. Oh, I know. So just simply for Monday, the plan in place right now is we won't know for sure until Sunday at some point regarding whether we'll be back on campus on Monday the 14th. I think there's at least a fair degree of likelihood that we will in fact be on campus again on Monday in the Psalm Center. That's my expectation and hope. But obviously, if we're still, in the midst of the smoky chaos that we've been dealing with, and we'll adjust, and then I would be posting another recording on Monday. So, which is fine. We can do that. I'm just kind of anxious to get back into the classroom if we can. So that's my hope that we'll be able to do that. I've been keeping you guys up to speed on what things to access. Keep doing that. If I'm not, if we're not on campus on Monday, then I'll obviously post that recording. I'll let you know. And if there are any alterations in the time frame with assignments, I'll obviously be letting you know that too. Just in passing, I want you to know I've been working on figuring out the book that I assigned, Meaning of Independence. I'm talking with our librarian right now about maybe getting that material to you guys in another format. I'm working on it. I will let you know as soon as I know. Worst case scenario, I can alter that assignment or the points for the semester, but I'm not ready to go there yet. I'm just going to try to see if I can get versions of that available for all the students so you guys can read through that book. And the other thing is this. So if you look on your course syllabus, you'll note that in about 2 weeks or so, in fact, 2 weeks, I believe, from today, we have an exam. That's the first exam for the semester. So sometime next week, probably either Wednesday or Friday of next week, I will be posting a study guide of sorts for you that you can begin to use. And when we get closer to that, I'll spend some time explaining my expectations for how you should study and what to expect on an exam like this. But just in the back of your minds, know that you've got some studying that will be coming up, some pretty heavy studying that will be coming up in about a week or so moving forward, and just try to map out your schedules a little bit with that kind of awareness. I think for the moment that's it, but I did want to start with this. Obviously, my hope would be that we were all together in a classroom setting on a day like September 11th. This is a critical day for us to remember. I think we're in the midst of the wildfires here in Oregon, and the very personal realities and physical challenges of that certainly are weighing in on us, and I totally understand. But I do hope that you all take some moments today to think about, maybe learn more about the events of September 11th, 2001, because they have a dramatic bearing on our nation, on our nation's history. And they were just, it was a horrible, catastrophic day. And one of the things I like to tell my students is this, as you see on the slide here on the screen. I think it's easy for something that's, like September 11th, that has been discussed in pretty dramatic presentations, and it's a national event, but it's like it's this broad international relations geopolitical event with all sorts of complexities and ramifications for nations and leaders, and uh, you know the war on terror that evolved as a result, things like that. In the midst of those kinds of discussions, it can be very easy, I think, to forget how how personal this was for a lot of people. And I just want you guys to understand that it's really important for all of us, myself included, but I'm going to urge you guys to do this. It's important for us to personalize this when we can, and to humanize when we have the opportunity to do so. And for me, September 11th is always a horrible day anyway, because I remember the events unfolding, like all of us who were old enough to remember where we were. I like all of my fellow Americans, I was watching the television coverage in a state of shock throughout the course of the day. None more, is referring to the shock. It was already bad. It became 1,000 times worse when I saw a news report about Flight 93, which left Newark and then was turning back with an attempt toward either the U.S. Capitol or the White House to crash a plane into one of those buildings. When the hijackers were confronted and the plane was re-seized by passengers, and the plane crashed into Shanksville, to a field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And when this news coverage happened, they started talking about a guy named Todd Beamer. And that's when September 11th for me went from the tragedy that it already was to becoming a much more personal tragedy, because Todd was one of my friends. We grew up together as kids in Wheaton, Illinois. He was a little bit older than I was, but we were in a lot of sports camps together, and we shared the same exact birthday, November 24th. And he became, sort of like an older brother in a sense to me. Really, really cool guy. Made a tremendous impact on my life. And so for me, September 11th has always been tragic, to be sure, but the memory of Todd has added a component of sorrow, a depth of sorrow that's very different than perhaps some would experience regarding September 11th. So I guess I would ask you this. I mean, I'm doing great. My family's, they know that this day is kind of rough on me, and my friends do as well. But I would ask this of you: just remember that folks like me exist, that we lost friends, that their families lost loved ones. I interact with Todd's widow, Lisa, throughout each year, and just sent her a message yesterday, letting her know that I'm thinking of her and her kids, and obviously thinking about all our memories of Todd. And she's doing great. Her family's doing great. Their oldest son, David, I remember, I remember when David was born. Actually, David just graduated from Wheaton College this past May. So Todd's family's doing well, but this is, as you can imagine, this is a particularly tough day. So please keep that in mind. Remember how horrific this was for us as a nation, but remember that there were so many, hundreds of families, hundreds of American families that were deeply affected by the realities of that day, and they have ongoing sorrows and regrets and some rough memories. So please do that. If you have not already done so, please say a quick prayer for families like the Beamers as we think back and remember what happened on September 11th, 2001. Okay. For us today, for this class, I want to start digging into Enlightenment philosophy. And then I think what I'll do today is I'm going to set the stage for what I'll be covering on Monday, which will be oriented toward what we know as the First Great Awakening. And I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit on Monday and wrestle with sort of the implications of how the Great Awakening preachers, how some of the things they did were positive, and maybe there were some negatives that came out of the awakening, even though we largely regard it as evangelicals, we largely regard the First Great Awakening and the Second as inherently good. I think there are some really good critiques that we can offer of both positives and negatives. So that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to kind of set the stage for that at the end of this video recording. And then on Monday, whether we're, on a recording video like we are right now, or whether we're together in the classroom on Monday, we'll talk about the First Awakening. So let's try to deal with Enlightenment philosophy. We've been moving through here in American culture, trying to contend with some of the early colonial patterns, and I've kind of taken us to the early 18th century, trying to figure out the ways in which Puritanism started to shape the American system. We've looked at some of the other colonies, like the Chesapeake colonies, for instance, down in places like Virginia and Maryland, and the business-based, the venture capitalism, in a sense, that was part of those original colonies. So we've looked at the impulses behind the establishment of different colonies along the eastern seaboard in North America by the 18th century, by the turn of the 18th century. And now I want to dig into a little bit of the philosophical impulses that go beyond theology or perhaps marketing or economics. We've looked at mercantilism, right? We talked a little bit about mercantilism the other day, and we're still before the ideas of somebody like Adam Smith, who's going to make some adjustments with the mercantile philosophy. So we do have to dive into what Enlightenment philosophers were thinking during this era, and what the impact of these philosophies really was. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try to understand how different the eras were that we were that we're walking through historically right now, and in this chronological fashion, how different these eras were in many respects, and yet how some of the principles of the Enlightenment, I think, rightly could be said to be alive and well, even in the 21st century. There are those who I think rightly argue, in fact, that the Enlightenment is still going on. Now, the age of reason, as we sometimes define it historically, the age of reason is sometimes constrained, right, to only about a century or so period where these ideas were promulgated and expanded around the globe, and then they were applied to various imperialistic projects and societal progression, things along those lines. Fair enough, I think there's some truth to that, but I also think that for Western civilization in particular, the giants of Enlightenment, the giant philosophers of the Enlightenment, they're still embraced, and their concepts still seem to be in operation in some form or another, even in our own time. So let's try to figure out what made the Enlightenment philosophers, what made their ideas so challenging, so different. Let's cast this through the lens of how Enlightenment philosophy was sort of a challenge to orthodox worldviews. So Enlightenment philosophy is going to is going to run in, headlong into the concepts coming out of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Reformation, where societies were understood, where they were constructed and they were understood through the lens of monarchies, through the lens of uh, religious orthodoxy, explaining the universe through, explaining life in the universe, but human life and human society through the lens of its relation to these basic foundations of society. So the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, right? The age of exploration and the Renaissance in its foundational form certainly brought some change, or maybe reasserted the idea that human beings had an important place to play in the world, and that they could in fact have a gigantic impact on the environment that surrounded them. But even through the Renaissance and the Reformation and on into the 17th century, there is still a basic approach to life that is sort of like a throwback to the Middle Ages in a sense. And religion certainly played an important part of that. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, both during and after the Reformation, certainly paint a picture of that. But the Enlightenment, one of the things that we see is that this notion of the human capacity to understand the world, to understand themselves, to understand how they relate to others, to understand all of it, not primarily, instead of primarily through the lens of religion, or the notion of a deity, the notion of a God, and the idea that human beings are placed on this world by a God who determines the course of all reality, and that human beings are subservient to that God, and that human beings cannot possibly understand some of the more complex nuances of life in the universe. So that concept, those traditional orthodox understandings of human life are definitely challenged in the 18th century by a number of thinkers who we associate with Enlightenment philosophy. Now, the interesting thing here is that many of these thinkers, by the way, would have described themselves as Christians. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here. John Locke, for instance, is sometimes grouped into into this association, where I think Locke at best is a form of deist. He's not the same deist as Ben Franklin is, but John Locke is certainly, I would regard him as a deist rather than an Orthodox Bible-believing Christian. There are similar questions about Newton, although I think Newton at least had a much better theological understanding of biblical Christianity and may very well have been a believer. But the reality is this: there were a lot of believers, a lot of Christians out there who were nonetheless convinced that faith and reason do not need to live at odds with one another. They do not need to be at odds with one another, that they could be integrated. And obviously, I suppose it goes without saying that I'm a proponent of that approach. I think the right-thinking Christian has to be very serious about their commitment to their faith and the responsibilities that we have as children of God. But I also believe that human beings are special creations on this planet of ours, and in this solar system, in this universe more broadly, and that we have been granted some pretty amazing mental faculties, and that the ability to use our minds and to reason through problems and to understand this world, that all is actually rather important. So, like some of my predecessors here who were Enlightenment philosophers and nonetheless Christians, I too believe that there are ways to seek some levels of integration and not always believe that there has to be universal separation. I would say this is not something we're covering right now, but I would fall under the defining philosophical realm of a Christian humanist. So joining the ranks of people like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and a number of others who were regarded as Christian humanists, understanding our place in this world and the human capacity to make a difference in this world, but ultimately also realizing that there are limitations to our knowledge and that God alone determines the course of humanity. So what did these challenges look like? Well, we had a number of interesting challenges to the previous Orthodox worldviews. Nicholas Copernicus in the 1530s, for instance, with his challenges regarding, mathematical measurements of the solar system and his usage of scientific instruments to actually observe, the stellar realities in our solar system. Very importantly, Isaac Newton, right? So Newton's critical for us. I don't think I have Newton here. So I don't have a picture of him anyway. So Newton's publication, his most crucial one is 1687, I believe, is the Principia Mathematica, sometimes simply just called the Principia, where he lays out his various theories. And these are important, right? So Newtonian physics is absolutely critical, and it's through Newton that we begin to make sense of how ingenious and how mathematically precise, the universe really is and how it functions. And gravitational theory is crucial in all this. So, what is his most famous claim, right? Is the third law of motion. With every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Or even Newton's first law is where he talks about, object at rest will stay at rest and object in motion will stay in motion. These are important observations. And Newton mapped these out, as I said, with mathematical precision in ways that others just hadn't ever really done, not to that extent anyway. Some ancient Greeks had dabbled with some of these theories of gravitation, but nobody in such precise ways as Newton. And it's very important. These are critical aspects of our knowledge base. So the age of reason involves guys like Copernicus and Newton. And even prior to them, we've got Galileo, and these are all very important. But the age of reason also involves those who are very much challenging not only scientific understanding or maybe expanding on scientific understanding, but they are challenging religious orthodoxy as well and religion's place in the human world. So I put on your outline that I posted for you guys that the age of reason, that during the European Enlightenment, you have the promulgation of 4 basic principles. And this I put on your outline. So you've got, the law-like order of the natural world as seen through the lens of Galileo, Copernicus, and Newton. You have the power of human reason, human intelligence versus religious tradition. And this is one of the stress points, one of the confrontation points that we see. Certainly for the Enlightenment as applied to Western civilization and specifically to the North American continent where these colonies are springing up and they have grown and expanded, we will see that the Enlightenment philosophies dealing with individual rights and responsibilities probably is the better way to put that. So the right of the individual, the right of self-government, the idea that that human beings in their placement in the universe as valuable thinking and doing beings, that they have rights, and responsibilities that have not always been recognized or given. This is a critical component. And there's also this notion through the age of reason that human beings have it within themselves to just kind of harness their abilities use their minds and use their creativity and their curiosity to kind of drive humanity forward, to drive it forward in this sense of improvement, dramatic, continual improvement. These are all very much at the heart and core of Enlightenment thinking. So I'm going to come back to that component. I want to talk a little bit about Locke and Hobbes. So Locke and Hobbes, two critical guys to know. John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. If you guys take a philosophy class, you'd delve into these guys a little bit more probably. But for right now, I just want to give you a basic intro. Actually, I'm going to we'll do Hobbes. I thought I had Locke on the screen, but I've got Hobbes where he needs to be. So Thomas Hobbes, a famous philosopher, and he writes this treatise that ultimately turns into kind of a full-blown book called Leviathan. And the idea with Locke and Hobbes, and also with a guy named Rousseau that we haven't really dealt with yet, Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau all believe in what we call contract theory of government, that essentially a right-thinking society contracts away some of its, a right-thinking individual in society contracts away some of his or her rights with the understanding that this is for the betterment of the whole. And how they contract, the reasons for contracting away those rights and the realities of that contractual agreement may be different, and they may be founded on different principles, but nonetheless, that human beings must decide freely, of their own free will, of their own volition, that they should sign on to this contractual agreement. And Hobbes' reason for this is different than Locke's. Hobbes essentially says that he's got a very cynical view of human beings, some of which I think we would understand is based in the idea that human beings are all pretty screwed up, and life is pretty hard. He writes in Leviathan that life, essentially, since life is as he defines it, Hobbes says life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. not a guy who's instilling a whole lot of confidence and zest in his readers, I suppose. So, in a human existence where all of life is nasty and solitary and brutish and short, and therefore very challenging, his belief is that it is better for an all-powerful state to exist. And in particular, he argues for the existence of a much more powerful leader to oversee the state. And his notion is that people being what they are, which is always scurrying around trying to find ways to kill each other in order to survive in this brutal world, his idea is that an all-powerful state, specifically an all-powerful leader, a monarch in most of Europe, that this is necessary. That this is actually the proper way for human beings to exist. So in Leviathan, he's arguing for this, and his suggestion is that this is how people are brought into line, and how rules are created that people must abide by, and how societies somehow avoid anarchy. That's essentially his argument. Well, okay. I mean, I'm not going to dig into all of that. I would say this, that Enlightenment thinkers over in North America about a century later are not as convinced by this argument. So you're not going to see a whole lot of references to Thomas Hobbes. I'm using him as a foundation because I want to compare what Hobbes says with what John Locke says. So these theorists who are rightly associated with the Enlightenment don't all agree about every single thing. The contract theory of government is one of the more famous political philosophies associated with the Enlightenment. And yet, as we're going to see here, they're not at all the same. So John Locke, sorry, if you used to watch a television show called Lost, then they patterned a character named John Locke after the famous philosopher, after the philosopher John Locke. So Locke is sort of the, one of the major figures, sometimes regarded as this, when it comes to political philosophy anyway, as the godfather of American political thought of this era. Although I would say that Montesquieu probably deserves an honorable mention. John Locke is a brilliant philosopher. I think that in many respects he has Thomas Hobbes beat in his construction of his theories, because they're just much more logically, founded and argued. So Locke believes, as did Hobbes. Locke believes that indeed human beings live in a very difficult world. But he believes that there are basic provisions that human beings should be given access to, and that they should fight for, and that is the right to eat. He looks at, basically the right to nourishment, what we must have to survive, the most basic elements of survival. And he makes some associations with property as well, which is why, by the way, that when Locke starts to argue for our natural rights, he's using very interesting phrases like life, liberty, and property. A phrase that actually Thomas Jefferson borrows pretty heavily from when he's writing the Declaration of Independence. So John Locke says, essentially, there have to be governments. There certainly do have to be, political leaders that oversee their nations in meaningful ways, and in ways that allow them to possess measures of power. But he also argues that those societies that understand human action and existence the best allow for the individual freedoms to be a priority, which is to say, Locke is laying the groundwork for something that others will build upon and develop even further, and that is basically this, that representational forms of government obviously have merit in the thinking of John Locke. Why is he saying this? He's making the argument because of his belief in the way that human beings exist, and that the human mind is constructed. So there are two things I listed on your outline. There's an essay he writes. Both of these essays actually are written and published in 1690. The first one is called Essay, a very important one, probably the more important of the two in some ways. It's called The Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And here is where Locke makes his famous argument about the tabula rasa, the Latin term simply meaning, as it's often translated, a blank slate. And in this argument, he's essentially saying that human beings aren't born with inherent full understanding of morality and ethics and virtue and right conduct and responsibility. So he's going against what we learn about in the New Testament, by the way. So he's going against what we learn about in Romans, where the Apostle Paul talks to us about the law that is written upon the hearts of all men. And indeed, the biblical suggestion that there is a level of universal moral conscience that exists in the hearts and minds of all human beings. The argument being that regardless of how your society may be structured, human beings are imbued with this notion, this universal notion that it's not right to walk up and club another human being to death for stealing your potato chip, right, and eating it. So, this is an ethicist's realm. We're not going to get into all these discussions today. But obviously, the biblical notion is that, at least in part, we as human beings do have an inherent, a built-in understanding, as we are designed to have, some awareness of who we are and how valuable our lives are, how valuable other lives are in relation to us, that there are some built-in moral principles in our hearts and minds. And there are some other things, of course, that we do learn. Locke is going against this tradition, and he's saying, no, none of that is inherent. It is not within us all from day one. We are experiencing life as a blank slate, the blank slate of human consciousness that becomes written upon. So our environment, our experience, our human reason, all of these things contribute ultimately to what we know to be true, which is why he starts talking about, cultural separation and differences, etc. He follows this up with another argument in his work called Two Treatises on Government, also published in 1690, where he begins to argue that, given the fact that human beings are experiencing life in different but valuable ways, and given the idea that societies will help individuals living within them, will help them form up the expectations, the values, the moral principles and ethical behaviors that are expected of them, that societies will help them build these things up in their minds over the course of their lives. He begins to make some arguments against this notion of divine political authority. And keep in mind, if you see the lifespan of John Locke, he's living, 1632 to 1704. So Locke is alive during the time when Europeans were living under autocratic governments at the behest of these monarchs. And the monarchs believed in something called the divine right of kings, right? That God had literally appointed them as individuals and as parts of these royal families, these royal houses, had appointed them to be complete authorities over all of their people. So the divine right of kings becomes a real problem in Europe throughout the course of the 17th century. King Charles found that out the hard way in Britain, and certainly by the time we get to the 18th century, the French kings are finding this out the hard way as well. Particularly Louis XVI found this out the hard way. So that there are those who are not as appreciative of this idea that the king has some all-powerful, all-knowing association and is therefore this benevolent, all-knowing ruler. John Locke doesn't buy into that, clearly. And Locke is suggesting that even if we maintain the existence of a monarchy, that perhaps there should be some checks upon the power of one individual, that the sharing of ideas and the sharing of virtues in societies where everyone has been brought up to value these same virtues, that actually has a lot of merit. So his social contract theory is suggested that these social contracts, or compacts, as John Locke phrases them, should be constructed to preserve our natural rights as human beings. Preservation even against autocracy, totalitarian authority that can exist in even the most well-intended monarchy. I mean, and Locke, let's be clear, Locke is not, he's not an idiot here. Locke remembers, as any good Englishman, he would remember that not too far before he himself was alive, back in the time of Henry VIII, that, the English monarch had run roughshod over many of his own people. And then the embattled England that occurred after his death on up until the time when you had Queen Elizabeth take the throne in the 1550s and on through 1603. She was the monarch in Britain. You're dealing with a period of extreme upheaval, and Locke is saying, look what can happen even in a country with mostly good principles, with a fair number of good leaders. You still have the capacity of of people to run roughshod over others. And that's with a parliamentary system that was already in place. So the English Civil War made a big impact on John Locke. He's alive during the midst of this chaos. Locke witnessed what happened to King Charles. He saw the reality of the brutal realities of what followed under Oliver Cromwell. And all of this is impacting him greatly. By the time he's a young man and he's beginning to think about these concepts, he's weaving them into his positions. And his idea here is that governments would do better to not think of themselves as completely removed from responsibility to the individuals, but rather to reverse course and suggest that individual ideas should have great merit, and shared ideas should be a huge component of how societies are structured and how they function. So these are all really important scenarios for John Locke. And even if you hadn't been aware of John Locke, I'm sure you're aware of this individual here. So here we've got another, another crucial guy. So you see that Locke and Franklin almost don't overlap at all. So Locke dies in 1704, and so Franklin's born in 1706, so they do not overlap. There's a 2-year difference between their lifespans. But Franklin was raised in a classical environment that exposed him to the ideas of John Locke. Locke, to his credit, he was so well thought of that even in his own lifetime, his ideas were gaining a lot of recognition. And Franklin is definitely an admirer of Locke, clearly. Franklin and Jefferson both. So Jefferson and Franklin would both be considered, Enlightenment thinkers in every conceivable sense. These guys are taking these concepts of individual liberty, and they're taking things like Montesquieu's spirit of laws. Montesquieu is another philosopher I'm not going to dig into for us today, but he's important. His concepts not only of individual liberty and spirit of laws, but also Montesquieu's most helpful contribution would come later on, really, when the framers are constructing the Constitution, because Montesquieu's concept of checks and balances on power become absolutely essential with the formulation of the US Constitution. But regardless, we're talking about individuals who are grabbing onto, gleaning the best of Enlightenment philosophy from guys like Locke in particular, and they're beginning to apply them. And Franklin is the epitome of the Enlightenment in America. I would say even more so than Jefferson in many respects. He was, older than Jefferson for starters, and had already been alive and well-traveled, experiencing much of what the world offered by the time Jefferson was a young man. So Franklin is kind of the beacon. He's the blueprint for the Enlightenment in America come the 18th century. And how do we know this? Well, it's really interesting when we begin to read through tracts like Poor Richard's Almanac, for instance, which is a publication put out by Benjamin Franklin under an assumed name. The whole tract, and by the way, this is a great time to mention this. I'm going to go back now. So why is this important? There would have been a time, even 100, 150 years prior, when it wouldn't have really mattered a whole lot what some of these people were thinking. The readership, the expansion or promulgation of their ideas would have been extremely limited, because prior to Gutenberg's press and the idea of periodicals and publications and newspapers and magazines as we now would understand those concepts, prior to the arrival and the expansion of those concepts into society, it was only a very select few in the educated class who were reading anything, including scripture in many respects. So so the application of printed materials and the idea, the expansion of this intellectual franchise, which said, you know, it is your right and your responsibility to know more and more about yourself and the world. This is a, you know, this is spurring on. This is an innovative concept that spurs on human curiosity in many parts of Europe. And you add that to the availability of ideas to not just the elite professors and universities across the world, especially we're talking about Europe and North America here. So not just the educated class, but even the rest of society. So that you had, you know, merchants and tavern owners who also, even as they worked at their businesses, or blacksmiths or whoever it might be, conceivably, at least theoretically, they too could at least have access to these concepts. And if they sought out, you know, the capacity to learn even, you know, basic concepts of reading, they could in fact take advantage of the ideas. Now, the reality may have been that the vast majority of tavern owners and fishermen and blacksmiths may not have been as interested in combing through some of these ideas, but some were. And the reality is this: a lot of the middle classes, the emerging European middle classes of the 18th century, they did understand that the expansion of the mind, that greater understanding gave them greater access to the world, to possibility in careers, in government, and whatever it may be. So, you know, I like to. It's just a very different time when the organizational concept around the power of thought, the power of the human mind, has really seized hold here. And when you have printing presses available and publications that are being churned out, uh, and and the average citizens in these colonies in North America are given increasing access to these concepts, then you have a really powerful enterprise that is being put in place. Which is why when we're talking about Franklin and something like Poor Richard's Almanac, we might think, given the explosion of information in the late 20th and 21st centuries with the internet and what have you, I think it's easy to forget how, you know, even though this would have been limited by comparison, how important it was that people had access to this material. Poor Richard's Almanac was the delight of colonists. So many people, not just in Philadelphia itself, where Franklin hailed from, but in colonies across that seaboard, many people had access to what Poor Richard's Almanac was framing, which is Enlightenment approaches to human life, essentially. All sorts of bits and pieces about individual liberty, responsibility, virtue, how these relate to governing authority, different approaches to this whole concept of Enlightenment philosophy and government. So Franklin is critical. In fact, I love that H.W. Brands, who's a historian, he calls Franklin the first American in a famous biography that he wrote about 15 years ago. And I think it's the right course. He uses Franklin as the window through which we can view the promulgation of American principles, what the ideals became for those seeking to be part of this new American experiment that begins to unfold in North America. So Enlightenment philosophy may have begun in Europe. It may seem to have been lost in, you know, not only the intellectual houses of Europe, like the universities, or perhaps in, you know, the coffee houses of France and whatnot, Italy and France. Maybe, you know, maybe philosophers were the ones who originally were generating the concepts. But as we see here, the concepts filtered down, and they were eagerly embraced and discussed by many others in both Europe and North America in ways that just end up having a tremendous impact on the formulation of revolutionary ideals. The American Revolution cannot be considered some sort of a weird happenstance or accident. It comes in the wake of Enlightenment principles regarding self-government, principles regarding individual liberty and self-government that had been spurred on by guys like Franklin, had begun to infiltrate the hearts and minds of a shocking number of colonials. And in the wake of things like the French and Indian War that we're going to be talking about very soon here, it cannot be a shock that the American revolutionary spirit arises from these circumstances. Okay, guys, that's where I'm going to stop for today. And on Monday, so I can take care of the First Great Awakening on Monday. I'll give you an intro and walk you through the whole thing then. Keep up with your reading. And obviously, as I was saying earlier, make sure you check your Corbin emails just in case there are some updates. I will hope to reconnect with you all in the Psalm Center on Monday, or 95% of you. I know we have a few who are Zooming in through the whole semester, but the vast majority of us are in the Psalm Center together when we're going through our class sessions. So that's my hope. If we're not, though, if the smoke situation remains an issue and whatnot, then I'll probably still do a recording. I'll see. Maybe we'll do a synchronous thing. But if we have to, we can do the remote learning thing for another class period or two. But I anticipate the real possibility of being back together on Monday. So I hope you enjoy your evening and weekend, and I will connect with you all again soon.